to see any details through it, but it was vaguely possible to see something. But anyway, it was now time to try and, hopefully, make it completely see-through. To do this, as I mentioned before, I had to infuse the wood with some sort of plastic, and the last time that I did this, I used an epoxy resin. There were at least a few things, though, that I didn't like about the epoxy. The first was that it was a two-part mixture, and the moment the two parts were mixed together, they would start to react. This gave me a limited time to work on it before it started to harden, and I found that this made things really rushed, and it was hard to do a good job. The second, and probably more important reason, is that epoxy has a tendency to turn yellow. This is often because of exposure to UV light, but I kept mine in a cupboard, and it still somehow happened. What I did find interesting, though, was that a lot of papers on transparent wood used epoxy, including the one that recently went viral. In fact, they often use the exact same stuff that I used. In my opinion, though, this was a major problem, especially considering that transparent wood is supposed to be a potential replacement for glass windows. Windows are constantly exposed to the UV and sunlight, and if epoxy were used, you'd probably end up with a nasty yellow window. This was one major thing that I liked about the paper that I decided to follow. They didn't go with epoxy, and they instead went with something called methyl methacrylate, or MMA for short. When this polymerized, it would make acrylic, also known as plexiglass, and it didn't have the same yellowing issue. Its polymerization was also triggered by heating it, and this meant that I could actually choose when I wanted it to harden. This all sounded pretty good to me, so I ordered some methyl methacrylate, as well as an initiator called AIBN. Unfortunately, I couldn't just add them both directly to the wood, and I first had to partially polymerize the MMA. To do this, I started by adding a very small amount of the initiator. After that, I poured in about 50 mils of the methyl methacrylate, and I dropped in a stir bar. I then turned on the stirring, and when everything had dissolved, I moved the flask to a hot water bath. When the temperature got above about 40 C, the initiator was supposed to start breaking down and releasing free radicals. These free radicals would then attack a molecule of MMA, which would turn into a more reactive form, which could attack another molecule of MMA. This process, known as polymerization, would then keep going, and it would slowly grow chains of methacrylate molecules. The length that these chains grew to was mostly determined by temperature and time, and the paper had reacted for 15 minutes at 75 C. So, after 15 minutes, I pulled it out, and I dropped it into some ice water. This quickly dropped the temperature, and it was supposed to stop the polymerization at whatever level it was at. I let it sit there for about 10 minutes, and I was now ready to add it to the wood. To do this, I got out my vacuum chamber, and I added some of the pre-polymerized MMA to a small dish. I then dropped in one of the pieces, and I made sure that it was completely submerged. I also covered it with another dish, because this step can sometimes splash a lot, and I closed the chamber. After that, I turned on my vacuum pump, and it started to bubble because air was getting pulled out of the wood. Then, as I pulled a stronger vacuum, it started boiling off the acetone, as well as some of the unpolymerized MMA. Over the next 15 minutes, the bubbling gradually slowed down, and eventually became more or less constant. I kept it going for another 15 minutes, and then and I was now ready to add 15 minutes. I pulled it out, and I dropped it into some which could start breaking down, got above about 40 C. I moved adding a very small amount of the initiator. After it finished of about 40 C, the initiator was supposed to start breaking down and releasing free radicals. These free radicals would then attack a molecule of MMA, which would turn into a more reactive form, which could attack another molecule of MMA. This process, known as polymerization, would then keep going, and it would slowly grow chains of methacrylate molecules. The length that these chains grew to was mostly determined by temperature and time, and I to react it for 15 minutes, I dropped it into some ice water. This quickly dropped the temperature, and it was supposed to stop the polymerization at whatever level it was at. I let it sit there for about 10 minutes, and I was now ready to add it to the wood. To do this, I got out my vacuum chamber, and I added some of the pre-polymerized MMA to a small dish. I then dropped in one of the pieces, and I made sure that it was completely submerged. I also covered it with another dish, because this step can sometimes splash a lot, and I closed the chamber. After that, I turned on my vacuum pump, and it started to bubble because air was getting pulled out of the wood. Then, as I pulled a stronger vacuum, it started boiling off the acetone, as well as some of the unpolymerized MMA. Over the next 15 minutes, the bubbling gradually slowed down, and eventually became more or less constant. I kept it going for another 15 minutes, and then I released the vacuum. This should have caused the MMA to start rushing into the wood, and filling all the spaces that the air and acetone used to occupy. I really thought that at this step, it would have started looking transparent, but it looked almost exactly the same. This
Привет, я Игорь Кравцов, коммерческий директор компании Cloud Payments. У нас нет клиентов, у нас есть партнеры. Мы ценим их время, поэтому подключаем интернет и клауд.
This didn't concern me too much though, and I thought that maybe it only cleared up when the MMA was fully polymerized. I then did 2 more vacuum cycles of 15 minutes, and at this point, the wood should have been completely filled with the MMA. Now, what I had to do next, according to the paper, was sandwich it between 2 pieces of glass. So what I did was drop it onto a glass square that I found on Amazon, and this part was actually the main reason why I chose to do this method. It was the only one that seemed to wedge it between glass, and their final pieces were nice and flat. When I looked closely at almost every other paper that I found, their samples were wavy or warped. But anyway, I then put another glass square on top of it, and I wrapped it all up with aluminum foil. I wasn't exactly sure what the aluminum foil was for, but the paper said to use it, so I just did what it said. With it all nicely packaged, I put it in my oven that I had preheated to 70°C, and I left it in there for 4 hours. As it sat there, the methacrylate was supposed to start polymerizing again, and when all of it had eventually reacted, I should have been left with solid acrylic. When I came back and took it out of the oven, I was hoping to see a super nice and beautiful piece of transparent wood. But that of course wasn't what I saw. It looks the exact same. Looks like I didn't do anything to it. Okay, so that was nothing short of a complete failure, and I was gonna have to try again. The MMA had all apparently just disappeared, but that was what the pre-polymerization was supposed to be preventing. By polymerizing it a bit and making some short chains, it should have been making it a lot harder for the MMA to vaporize, and so that it wouldn't just disappear in the oven. Something clearly went wrong though, and I thought that maybe it was the initiator. It was possible that it might be old or bad or something, so this time, I tried using twice the amount. Unlike last time, it started releasing some small gas bubbles, and this was all nitrogen. It was forming as the initiator was being degraded, and it was a good sign that it was actually working. The fact that I didn't see this happen last time probably meant that I'd barely done anything. Over the next 15 minutes, it also got thicker and thicker, which was another good sign, and it meant that it was actually polymerizing. Like before, I then pulled it out, and I dropped it into ice water. When it got to around room temperature, I added the thicker MMA to the dish. I then dropped in another piece of wood, added a bit more MMA, and started the same vacuum cycle. After turning on the vacuum though, I realized that I had gotten a bit too excited and I had forgotten to add the cover dish. This wasn't a huge issue though, because besides that first pop, it wasn't actually splashing very much, and I just added it after the first cycle. Unlike last time, as I continued pulling a vacuum on it, the MMA slowly got thicker and thicker. I think this was because it was pulling off a lot of the unpolymerized methacrylate and concentrating the partially polymerized stuff. This evaporation was also causing it to cool down, which would thicken it even more. After the last vacuum cycle, the wood still wasn't completely clear, but it did look a bit more transparent. I then took it out, squished it between some new glass squares, and threw it in the oven. I was again hoping that it would just magically clear up and look amazing, but that wasn't the case. I mean, it was definitely better than before, but I wouldn't call it good. Also, a major problem that I was noticing was that it looked like the acrylic was stuck to the glass. As far as I know, this issue was never mentioned in the paper, and I kind of just assumed that as it cooled, that it would pop itself off. However, that clearly didn't happen. The good news is that it actually worked this time. Kind of. The bad news is, it sucks. Even at room temperature, it was completely stuck, and to get it off, I made some score lines in the glass. I then got out my hammer, and I carefully smashed it to pieces. I also did the exact same thing to the other side, and I was eventually able to free my piece. There was unfortunately still some glass stuck to it though, so again, I carefully hit it with the hammer. After that, I used a Dremel, and I cut off the extra bits of plastic. I also sanded it, just to clean it up a bit. The final piece was only kind of transparent, and it was a bit disappointing. What was good though was that it was completely flat, and it didn't look bent at all. When I tested it, I had to use a lot of backlight, but it was possible to see through it. It was still super hazy though, and a lot of it was still very yellow. This yellowness told me that I clearly hadn't treated the wood pieces for long enough, and there was still too much lignin in there. I think the biggest problem though was that I'd made the pieces way too thick. I did this because I was really worried that they were going to fall apart, but they turned out to be totally fine. So, this extra thickness wasn't really doing anything, and it was basically just making it hazier. It was making the whole thing a lot less transparent, even in the non-yellow parts that kind of looked okay. Based on this first, and kind of successful run, I had a bunch of issues to fix, and the first thing that I did was cut some thinner pieces. I was clearly a bit too ambitious trying to make them so thick, and they for sure had to be reduced, but I didn't want to go all the way down to 1 millimeter. I instead settled for 1.5 millimeters, and I found these thinner balsa strips on Amazon. I then did the exact same process as before, except this time, I made sure to keep going until they were completely white. This ended up taking about 7 hours, and when I felt they looked okay, I dropped them all into some water, and I compared them to the older pieces. The difference was pretty obvious, and what I had now was definitely a lot better. I then dried the pieces using solvents, but this time, because it was way cheaper, I used 99% isopropyl alcohol instead of the ethanol. This again took a few days, and when it was done, they were already kind of transparent. Now, for the pieces of glass, I stopped using those thin and flimsy ones. I instead found these coasters on Amazon, which were much thicker, and hopefully a lot stronger. I also decided to spray them with some mold release to prevent the acrylic from getting stuck to the glass. The only issue was that I had no idea how to properly apply it, and I ran into a bunch of problems. After a few small tests though, I found something that seemed to work. Both of the plates were first cleaned with some alcohol, and then I lightly sprayed them with the mold release. After that, I used a brush to spread it out, and to try to give it an even coating. I let it evaporate for about 10 minutes, and when it started beading up, I wiped it around to even it out. I then added a second layer by repeating the exact same thing, and when that was done, I polished it with a microfiber towel. This left me with a pretty shiny and clean surface, which the acrylic hopefully wouldn't get stuck to. With this all ready, I prepared some more methyl methacrylate, but even with twice the initiator, it didn't work in 15 minutes. It instead took 30 minutes to thicken, and I have no idea why. But either way, I now had everything that I needed, and I started treating one of the pieces. I did the exact same thing as before with 3 vacuum cycles, and when it was done, it was looking pretty good. I then carefully dropped it onto one of the new pieces of glass, sandwiched it with another one, wrapped it, and put it in the oven. With all the changes, I was extremely hopeful for this one, but it of course also kind of failed. The wood was definitely more transparent, but the glass had somehow tipped over. The combination of the stronger glass and the mold release seemed to work though, and I was able to easily pop off the top one. It actually worked. However, the actual piece of wood unfortunately didn't pop off as nicely. This made it even sadder than I had hoped. Why? But at least the problems were quite fixable. So, I decided to quickly try it again. This time, after dropping on the treated piece of wood, I added some spacers that I had cut out of the untreated balsa. I figured it was an easy fix to stop the glass from tipping over, and I also used aluminum tape to hold it all in place. This felt a lot more solid than before, and it was way better than just trying to balance everything on a piece of wood in the middle. Also, because of the issue before with the piece of wood still getting stuck, I treated the glass with 4 layers of mold release instead of just 2. The result from this run, finally, wasn't a complete disaster. For a second though, I did think that the piece was stuck again, but that wasn't the case. The piece from this one was even better, however, it was still a bit problematic. The side that was touching the bottom plate was almost completely smooth and shiny, but the other side looked like it was missing acrylic in the middle. I wasn't sure why this happened, and I thought that maybe it was just because the surface of the wood wasn't perfectly flat. It was possible that the glass was only touching it in a few high spots, and there was a slight gap between the rest. To fix this, I thought that it might work to just put some weight on it and to really squish it together. So now, for the hopefully final attempt, I did it pretty much in the exact same way as the last one. I then put it in the oven, and for the weight, I needed something that was small, but really heavy. I initially had no idea what to use, and I probably spent 15 minutes just walking around the room looking for something. What I ended up finding turned out to be perfect though, and it was the 5-pound tungsten cube that I had randomly bought over a year ago.
Давай возьмем кредит, как-нибудь недорого.
Это надо искать.
Смотри.
Банки.ру легко подберет выгодный кредит с высокой вероятностью одобрения.
Здорово!
Банки.ру знает, где выгоднее.
I then waited the usual 4 hours, and when I opened it up, I was pretty happy with what I saw. I let it sit for about 30 minutes to cool down, and then I took it apart. It was a bit stubborn, but it was pretty easy to crack it open with a screwdriver. Like before, I got rid of the extra plastic using a Dremel, and I also sanded it a bit. This one, was by far the best result, and I felt that it looked pretty good. The top side was still a bit rough, but the bottom was close to perfect. So the extra weight apparently didn't do very much for the top, but it seemed to help the bottom. Now, when I tested it, it was way more transparent, and I could easily read the text through it. My only issue with this piece was the rougher top, and I started thinking that maybe the top just had problems. However, I thought that the fix was relatively easy. I figured that all I had to do was just selectively treat the top rough side by painting some more methacrylate on it. I would then do the exact same vacuum cycle, and I would squish this treated side against the bottom glass. In my mind, this made total sense, and I was almost certain that it would work. So I did the really smart thing, and I completely skipped trying it. I instead just assumed it would work, and I jumped right into scaling things up. I honestly thought that it was just going to be really straightforward and easy, because I assumed it was just what I had done before, but bigger. However, that turned out to be a terrible assumption. I quickly learned that the larger scale had a whole bunch of its own issues that never even occurred to me. For example, any gas bubbles that formed now had a much harder time escaping, especially if they formed near the middle of the piece. This gave me a couple attempts where there were clearly some bubbles that got trapped. I also had one run where the piece cracked as it was cooling down, and another one where the methacrylate drifted away from it while it was in the oven. There was also my favorite one, which absolutely refused to separate from the glass, and I had to help it a bit. I think the saddest part, though, was when I found out that it wasn't going to work to selectively treat one side. I mean, it did technically work, and I was able to get two sides that were smooth, but it also introduced a bunch of weird cracks. I did think it was kind of interesting, though, and it had a cool effect when I turned the piece 90 degrees. But with all that being said, the main point here is that scaling it up turned out to be a lot trickier than I thought. On the surface, the process appeared really simple, but every small detail seemed to matter. Eventually, though, after a week of what felt like constant failures, I came up with a process that I felt would work. To try it out, I cooked up what I was hoping would be my last piece, and I soaked it in the same solvents. When that was eventually ready, I started making the pre-polymerized methacrylate, and this time, I used a lot less initiator. Instead of twice the amount, I now only use 20% more. Also, in general, I found that this was actually one of the hardest parts. This was because I found that there was an optimal thickness or viscosity that I had to bring it to, but it never seemed to take the same amount of time. Sometimes it was ready after as little as 15 minutes, and other times it took closer to 40. It's very possible that I was just doing something wrong, but either way, I ended up having to use a method that wasn't exactly super scientific. I basically just got good at shaking it around and looking at it, and knowing when it was ready. When it eventually got to what I felt was the right thickness, I pulled it out, and I dropped it into ice water. When it had cooled down to around room temperature, I poured it all into a large dish. I then dropped in the piece of wood, and I made sure that it was completely submerged. Now, I again had to do the 3 vacuum cycles on it, but this time I had to do them for much longer, at around 45 minutes each. I also pulled the strongest vacuum that I possibly could to try to get rid of all the acetone, as well as any unpolymerized methacrylate. I found that this was important because otherwise they would boil off as they sat in the oven and potentially introduce bubbles. There was a side effect to the extended vacuum, though, and it caused the methacrylate to thicken a lot more. This made it very important to start with methacrylate that wasn't too thick, otherwise it would sometimes start to solidify before the end of the 3rd cycle. When it was done, I pulled it out, and I dropped it on a much larger glass plate. This plate was originally meant for 3D printers, and I had already treated it 4 times with mold release. I also made sure to completely polish the entire thing. Any unpolished parts could cause the acrylic to stick, and this was why one of my pieces ended up cracking. It could also cause it to not separate at all, and I really didn't want to have to smash any more glass. In most of the other runs, I used small wood spacers to help stabilize the glass plates, but I realized that they were actually sabotaging me almost the entire time. I think it took me way too long to find this out, but apparently methyl methacrylate contracts as it polymerizes, and it can lose up to 21% of its original volume. This meant that my piece was potentially shrinking quite a bit as it cured, and with the wood spacers in place, it was pulling itself away from the upper glass plate. This made it so that all the weight that I had added was basically doing nothing, and I had to stop using them. When I first realized this, I thought it was going to be a problem, and that I'd have to come up with some other way to balance the plates. However, it turned out that on this larger scale, they weren't even needed. The piece of wood was now big enough that there wasn't really an issue balancing the glass plate on it, and as long as I kept it more or less centered, it was totally fine. At this point, things were looking pretty good, and I put it in my oven. I then loaded it up with a much larger tungsten cube, which was coincidentally the perfect size, and it weighed about 40 pounds. I had bought this one around the same time as the smaller one, and I had originally planned to use it for a video. I never really ended up getting around to doing that. However, I like to think that this technically counts. With everything in place, I made sure that everything was all level so that the methacrylate wouldn't drift. Then, when I felt that it looked good, I closed the oven and I turned it on. In a lot of the other runs, I preheated the oven, but I found that it worked better when it heated up slowly from room temperature. Now, it was just a matter of waiting, and I was pretty anxious to see the result. When I came back...
Яндекс, самая большая компания на рынке СНГ, придумала, как умножить капитал жителей России. Проект Яндекс Капитал уже приносит своим клиентам от 75 тысяч рублей в день. А оборот компании ежедневно составляет 50 миллионов долларов. Алгоритм Яндекс подключает ваш аккаунт к нейросети и на основе массива данных Big Data и технологии блокчейн добывает деньги быстрее, чем любой человек. Группа из 100 математиков, аналитиков и финансистов не сможет опередить решение Яндекс Капитал. Пока человек зарабатывает $10, Яндекс Капитал зарабатывает